Hi, I'm Izzy, and this is Dizzy Quilts and Sews. Today is the last installment in our Quilt As You Go sampler, Quilt Along. So we are going to be binding our quilt and putting on a label. All right, so to finish off our quilt, you are going to need a few things. So first of all, obviously, you need your assembled quilt. So if you've not assembled all of your blocks yet, I'm going to link to the video that's going to show you how to do that. So that comes first. Obviously, you need your quilt. Second, you need some fabric to cut your binding strips from. I'm going to use the same gray I used as my background fabric on my quilt. So this is a Kona Solid. Yeah, this is the Dove colorway. So I'm going to tell you exactly what you need to cut from this, but you do need some fabric, not a ton of it, but some of it. And then you need to have prepared a label. Now, a label from your quilt, for your quilt, can be as simple as a square that you're going to sew onto the back of your quilt and handwrite your name, the date, the name of the quilt, whatever information you want to put on there. It could be as complicated as an actual pieced block that you're then going to sew onto the back of your quilt. I made an embroidered label for mine, so this is what mine looks like. Hopefully you're not seeing this backwards, but so made by Isabelle Jean and the date. So that's going to be the label. You'll notice that I used a scrap from the fabric I used for my quilt, so everything is going to go together nicely. You're going to need a rotary cutter and a mat, as well as a large quilting ruler, so a 6 by 24 inch ruler to cut your strips for your binder, for your binding. You're going to need a walking foot on your machine, as well as thread that matches your binding fabric really, really well, unless you want the stitches on your binding to really pop on the back of your quilt. From the front, they're going to be literally invisible, but they will show on the back of your quilt on top of the binding when we stitch it down by machine. To put your label onto the back of your quilt, you're going to need a hand sewing needle and some thread, not a ton of it, just to sew down 2 of the sides, because I'm going to show you how to sew your label into the binding so that you only have to hand stitch 2 of the 4 sides. All right, so let's go over to the sewing machine. Or before we do that, let's talk about how much of your binding fabric you're going to need. So you need to measure all 4 sides of your quilt, especially if your quilt is not perfectly square. Mine is fairly square, and I measured one side and it's 36 inches. So you need enough fabric to go around all 4 sides, plus 8 to 10 inches of wiggle room. So my quilt measures 36 inches square, so I'm gonna need 144 inches to go around, plus about 10 inches, so that's 154 inches. So if you're not cutting from yardage, make sure you calculate all of that and cut your strips, and then you'll sew them all together, but I'm going to show you at the sewing machine how to do that. So get your fabric cut so that once pieced together, you're going to have at least the whole circumference of your quilt plus 8 to 10 inches of binding. All right, let's go sit at the machine. All right, so here we are at the sewing machine. A couple of things I forgot to mention, which are pretty important. The width of your binding strips needs to be 2.5 inches, 2.5 inches. And I know that a lot of tutorials out there tell you to cut your binding strips at 2¼ inches, but because we're going to be sewing this on by machine, and anyways, the way I'm going to show you how to do this, doing it at 2¼ really does not allow you any room for mistakes or little wobbles. So I'm going to suggest you do 2½ inches, and especially if this is your first time or if you're a beginner putting on binding strips on a quilt, yeah, 2.5 is going to be much, much better. I still do 2.5 on all of my quilts. That is just my preferred width for my binding strips. Another thing I forgot to mention in terms of supplies, you're going to need some binding or clips or binder clips, any kind of clips. You're probably not going to be able to pin your binding into place. There's just going to be way too much thickness there. So I've got my strips here of binding. I've got 4 of them to go around my quilt and leave me with a little extra at the end. And to piece these together, it is quite simple. So you're going to take your first strip, and you're going to do this. You're going to place it right side up, and then take your second strip. Now this is going to be difficult for you to see because my fabric is a solid, but you're going to take your second strip and put it right side down on top of the first one at a 90-degree angle. So hopefully you can see this. So I've got my first strip here, and this is the right side of the fabric. And then I'm putting my second strip on top of it right side down at a 90-degree angle. And I'm going to sew from corner to corner this way. All right, you can mark this if you want to. I'm not going to because I'm just going to eyeball it. Plus I've got some markings on my sewing machine bed to help with this. So right from corner to corner with a regular stitch length. Where's my petal? There it is. All right, and you'll notice I already have my walking foot on my machine. Let me angle you down a little bit. You don't need to see my face. There we go. All right, so here's the first seam. So when you open this up, you can see the seam here, and they're nicely aligned. I do have a bunch of extra fabric here, and you can trim this, leaving about a 1/4 inch seam allowance, like this. There you go. And once you press this open, you'll have a nice flat seam, and it'll barely be visible once you sew this onto your quilt. And also doing it this way with the 90-degree angle, it reduces some of the bulk when you go to sew this onto your quilt. All right, so do this for all of your strips. So I'm just gonna continue with the right side of the strip I just finished piecing together, and then grabbing my next one and putting it right side down at a 90-degree angle, and then sewing from corner to corner. Try to be as precise as you can be here, because if you're not, you might have like a jog in your binding, which is not the end of the world. There you go. All right, and then my last piece. So the piece I just finished right side up, and then the new piece right side down, my 90-degree angle, and then I'm just gonna sew from corner to corner. All right, come on. There we go. All right, so I'm going to go and trim all of my excess fabric. I'm going to go over to my pressing station and press these seams open. And once your seams are pressed open, you can go ahead while you're at the pressing station and press your entire binding strip in half, wrong sides together, so that your binding looks like this. All right, so the entire length of your binding, once all sewn together, you need to press down in half, basically, wrong sides together. And once you've done that, come back here and we'll start sewing it onto our quilt. All right, so I've got my binding over here. It's all put to the right side of my machine where it's not gonna interfere with anything. And I've got my quilt ready to get its binding on. All right, so we're gonna start in the middle-ish of one of the sides. And you'll notice I have the quilt right side up. And I'm gonna take the binding, leaving about this much free. So I'm gonna start sewing over here. And I'm gonna place this down about in the middle of my block here. And with the walking foot, I'm going to stitch the binding. So I've got the raw edges of my binding here aligned with the raw edges of my quilt, right? So the fold on my binding is over here. And I'm going to sew this down with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Again, try to stick to a 1/4 inch, not go a lot bigger than that, because then you're going to run into trouble when it's time to put your binding to the back. So we're going to stitch, back stitch at the start, and start going towards our first corner. Take your time, no rush. All right, now I'm getting close to the corner, so I'm going to stop. And I'm going to put a pin right before the edge of my quilt at the bottom. And I'm going to put a pin at about a 1/4 inch away from the bottom. All right, so I've got a pin right here. So I'm stitching my binding down this way. And I placed a pin in my quilt at 1/4 inch away from the bottom. And this pin is going to help me know when to stop stitching. All right, so I'm going to leave it there. All right, let's see if I can do this with one hand. So I'm going to leave it in there, and I'm going to stitch. All right, it's not great, but okay. All right, I'm going to go really slow and stop right when I get to my pin right there. All right, now I'm going to take my pin out because I don't need it anymore. I'm going to lift my presser foot, take my quilt and move it 45 degrees so that my walking foot and my needle are now pointing at the corner of my quilt. I'm going to put my foot down and I'm going to stitch right off the edge. And then I'm going to cut my thread and take it out from under the needle. All right, now you're going to take the binding, move it completely to the right, and then finger press the fold here. And then holding it there, this fold, you're going to move it to the left, making sure that you have a fold right here aligned with the edge of your quilt. This is not easy with one hand, let me tell you. There we go. So I've got a fold right here aligned with the edge of my quilt. All right, let me hold on for a sec. And I'm going to place a clip. There we go, right there to hold it. And then I'm going to turn my quilt and start stitching down the next side. But I'm going to start stitching right at the corner, right at the fold right here. All right, can you see where I'm positioning my foot? Right there. And then I'm going to go straight down that side and do the exact same thing at the next corner and repeat that until I get to the last corner. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and do that and meet you back here when I'm at the last corner. All right, so I just turned my last corner. I'm about to start sewing on the side where we basically started. So I have my clip holding my fold in place, and I'm going to sew, or I'm going to start my seam here, just like we did the other ones. But I'm going to stop about, maybe 4 inches in, back stitch, and cut my thread. So now we've got loose binding over here and loose binding over here where we started. Obviously, if I show you this, there's just way too much binding going on here. I've got all of this extra length here, so I'm going to need to cut this down. But before I cut this down, whoops, I'm sorry, I need to make sure that when I sew these two pieces together, they're going to lie nice and flat on our side here. So I'm going to take you over to my cutting table where I can spread this quilt out and show you what we're going to do next. All right, so I've got my quilt, all right, down flat on a surface. I've got the extra binding on this end, the extra binding on this end, and the goal here is to sew the two of them together so that when they're sewn together and then sewn onto the quilt, it'll be one nice flat seam all along. All right, so basically one thing you could do is take the extra long bits that you've got left and cut off, like let's say up to here. So about halfway between your last stitches and your first stitches here. So we're going to get rid of this. And then bring this, so leave this tail end here flat up against your quilt. And then bring the other one on top of it. And you can eyeball this, that's what I do. But basically you want this strip here to overlap the other one by 1/4 inch or thereabouts. And then you just cut the extra. Now this is the super quick way of doing it. Another way we could have done it is make sure the overlap is 2.5 inches and then piece the two ends at a 90-degree angle like I showed you for the other ones. I usually do it this way, the quick way. That way all you need to do is take your two ends here, bring them together, pin them, and sew them at 1/4 inch, and then finish sewing your binding down with your walking foot. All right, let's go back to the machine and do that. All right, so I'm at the machine, so I'm going to take one end and open it. Take the other end and open that, and then put them right sides together like this. I'm going to put a couple of pins just to hold this together. And then I'm going to stitch this at 1/4 inch seam allowance. Back stitching at the start and end, just to make sure everything stays together nicely. Alright, now your seam over here, you can just finger press it open. Make sure you press it open to reduce some of the bulk, like this, and then fold it back down together, following the crease you made. Alright, and now you can test it out and see if it's going to lay flat, and it's looking not bad. Any tightness is going to get taken care of by my walking foot. So I'm going to put the quilt back under the needle, and I'm going to start sewing exactly where I left off. I'm going to start back stitch and then slowly finish sewing the binding to the front of the quilt. Make sure your raw edges stay together. Make sure you're not going to get any puckers. And then you can stop where the first stitches start, and then back stitch and cut your thread. And there you go. Your binding is now sewn to the front of your quilt. Alright, next you're going to get your clips, and you're going to flip your quilt so that you're looking at the back, and gently you're going to flip the binding to the back, making sure that you're covering all of your stitches. Get rid of any loose threads. Bring it to the back, and then clip it with your sewing clip or Wonder Clips. Like this. And you're going to go all the way around your quilt. I like to put clips every, I don't know, 2 or 3 inches. And what I do is when I bring the binding over, I pull ever so gently so that when I sew from the front, because that's what we're going to do, we're going to sew on the front right in the ditch, catching the binding on the back. So I need to make sure that the binding here, my fold, goes further than the ditch on the right side of the quilt. Hope that's making sense. Alright, I'm going to show you how to deal with the corners when I get to it. Alright, once you get to your corner, take off the clip that you put there when you were sewing it to the front, and bring your binding to the back. Alright, the entire corner, and then pull a tiny bit to make sure you've got the entire corner out. And then lay it flat. Bring the binding to the back, put a clip close to the corner, and then fold the corner one side at a time. So basically what I'm doing here is I'm putting one side down completely, following the edge of my quilt, and then I'm going to take the other side and bring it in, forming a nice mitered corner, and then I'm going to put a clip in there to make sure it doesn't go anywhere. All right, so I'm going to show that to you again. So I've got a clip close to my corner. I'm going to bring this side down like this. And then I'm going to take the other side, making sure this one stays put, and I'm going to bring it in like this to form a nice mitered corner and put a clip on it. And then continue going around the entire quilt. So clip your binding down. Oh, one thing I need to show you is how to put your label in. So once you get to the corner, I like my label to be on the lower, one of the lower corners. So I'm going to turn my quilt around and see. Does it really matter? Oh yeah, my cactus are right here. So this is the bottom row of my quilt. So I want my label to be either on this corner here or on the other corner. Probably on the other one. So when you get to the corner where you want your label to be, grab your label and align it to the back of the quilt, raw edges to raw edges. And then when you bring your binding to the back at the corners like I showed you before, you're going to basically clip the binding on top of your label so that your label is going to get caught in the seam when you're stitching in the ditch from the front. Let me show you what that's going to look like real quick. All right, so I've got my corner. I'm just going to keep clipping my binding. Oh, I need to take a pin out. There you go. So once it's clipped into the corner, it's going to look like this. You'll see that these sides here are loose. I'm going to hand stitch those down when I get there. But make sure you select whichever corner your label is going to go into, and as you're clipping the binding to the back, or turning it to the back and clipping it, make sure you've got your label nice and snug into this corner so that you're going to sew it down on those two sides when we stitch in the ditch from the front. All right, so continue clipping your binding to the back, and then we'll come back and I'll show you how to stitch it down. So I'm done pinning the binding to my quilt, and now I've got the quilt right side up again under my needle, and the needle is going to go in exactly like right next to the binding here in the ditch, not on the binding. You need to stay as close as possible to the binding and go slow, especially if, like me, your binding fabric is the exact same as your background fabric. It gets very difficult to see where your needle is going in. So I'm going to put my needle down. Beautiful. So it's going right in the ditch, and I'm going to very slowly sew all the way around. I'm going to leave my clips in there until I get to them, just to make sure that nothing moves. And then when you get to the corner where your label is, make sure your label's not getting folded or getting caught, and basically just go around the entire quilt. When you get to a corner like this, make sure your needle goes right into the corner, and then needle down, pivot your quilt, and continue quilting down. All right, so go all the way around your quilt and meet me back here. All right, so now I'm getting back to the beginning. My first stitches are right here. So I'm just gonna keep sewing until I overlap with my first stitches just a little bit, and then back stitch, and then cut my thread, and then I'm just gonna trim this thread here, and there we go. So on the front, you can barely see your stitching because they're right up in there in the ditch, and on the back, this is what you see. So you've got, oh, I've got some threads here. So you've got the fold of the binding here, and your stitching line should be fairly close to that fold. And it's not going to be perfect because you obviously can't see what you're doing. Mine is never perfect, but as long as you manage to catch the binding from the front all the way around, then you're good. So have a look at your corners. There's my corner. Look how nice that is. So make sure that you caught the corner. So this is what it looks like from the back, and in the front, look at that. You can barely see any stitches. And then my label is somewhere in here. There we go. So my label is here. It's upside down for you, but I've pinned it down on the two loose sides, but it's stitched nicely right in here, caught all along those two sides, so it's nice and secure in here. So to finish your quilt now, just go and hand stitch the last two sides of your label. You can use some nice long big running stitches as long as it's going to be secure enough, especially if you intend to wash your quilt by machine. I like to just use an invisible stitch. I do small stitches close together, and I've never had any issues with my labels coming undone. So there you go. And there you go. You have a beautiful quilt, all bound and labeled. And hopefully you are super happy with it. I love my little quilt. I mean, I don't have any new babies coming that I know of anyways. So I might actually turn this into a wall hanging. And to do that, there are a number of different ways, because I know one of you asked me to speak about how to hang a quilt. Depending on the size, there are a number of different things you can do. As silly as it sounds, I have put up wall hangings before with thumbtacks that I just hammer into the corners of my quilt and into the wall. So for small quilts, that's how I would put them up. What you can do is sew a sleeve, and you can Google that, how to sew a hanging sleeve for a quilt. So you basically sew a rectangle of fabric onto the back of your quilt. You put a stick or a dowel or something in there, and then you can use command hooks or nice decorative hooks and basically hang your dowel on top of that, and your quilt is going to hang down very nicely. I think that's what a lot of quilt shows do. So if you submit one of your quilts for a show, for example, they are most likely going to ask you to sew a sleeve on the back of it. So definitely Google that, how to sew a sleeve onto the back of a quilt. Super, super simple, and you can hang your quilts that way. You can probably also sew fabric triangles into the corners. So basically making little pockets of fabric into the corner, and then you just put your stick into the corner and then put it up on the wall that way. So there are a number of different ways to hang your quilt if you want to turn this into a wall hanging. So I want to thank you if you've been following along since the very beginning. Thank you so much for sticking with it, for making all of your blocks every month and putting them up on Instagram. I've had such an amazing time following along with all of you. If you just discovered this video and you want to get started making this quilt, there is a playlist on my channel where each video is going to take you through step by step, piecing your block, quilting your block. You're going to learn a bunch of different techniques. And then, yeah, at the end of it, put your binding and your label on, and you're going to have a very nice baby-sized quilt. Now, if you've been a little bit on the fence about making this quilt, or if you're a little more experienced and really don't need all of the hand-holding, I put together a PDF document of all of the cutting and piecing instructions for each of these 9 blocks into somewhat of a pattern, and I'm going to put the link to that below. The pattern will include links to these videos if you do want the hand holding at any point, so you'll be able to click on a link right from the PDF, and that'll take you to one of these videos where I show you how to do it. So thank you again for those of you who've watched, who've commented, who've made the blocks. This was my first ever quilt along, and I loved it so much. I'm already planning the 2025 quilt along on Dizzy Quilts and Sews. So thank you for watching. Please give the video a like on your way out if you liked it, and consider subscribing to the channel. Thanks again, and I will see you soon.